Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry De Silva. Well, have we got a guest for you? I'm telling you, this is probably the first lady of women's basketball, and she has a book that we are going to be talking about called "You Let Some Girl Beat You," and I'm speaking of Meyers Drysdale, who has written this book, published by Baylor Publications. Ann, of course, is one of the greatest stars in the history of basketball. And she's multi-talented, NBA executive, WNBA executive, general manager. She's done everything, I think, but coach, and we'll even ask her why she didn't do that. But welcome to Studio 411, Ann Meyers Drysdale. Ann, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Larry. Been looking forward to it.
Tell me now, when you put the book together, what was the motivation, or who motivated you to put the book together with your life story up until that time?
Well, actually, the author, Joni Ravenna, she was a family friend of one of my brothers, and she's a writer. And she and I had kind of hooked up, and we were talking one day, and she said, I'd really like to get involved in writing your story. And I said, no, I don't have any plans on writing my story. And really was not interested in doing a book, and very insecure about it, and really didn't want to talk about my family, and which I always do talk about my family. But she talked me into it, and we had a lot of nights that were, I said, I don't want to tell that story. And then she'd wait 2 or 3 days, and she'd convince me that that would be a story to be added into the book. And it took me over 2 years to do it. It took me, because I was traveling a lot, and we didn't get a lot of face-to-face time. A lot of things were done on the phone while I was on the road broadcasting. And but I think Joni really captured a lot of my life at that time, and certain things that happened.
So she's a medalist in her own right. If she got you over a 2-year period to put that out, very persuasive. My goodness, I look forward to speaking with her someday about.
Yeah, she's very talented.
Yeah.
She writes plays, and she writes other stories and for magazines, and so she's very talented.
We'll get back to the book and, of course, your life in a minute. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that were, seems like always in the media, but these last couple of years, especially in 2019, a headline I saw, NBA jobs becoming women's work. And we had such people, of course, you were probably the forerunner, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as getting a front office position with an NBA team as opposed to just a WNBA team. But in 2019, former UConn greats, of course, folks here in the Connecticut area would know Sue Bird, Swin Cash. You've got, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce her name, Kelly Krauskopf, amongst others that are rapidly ascending to major positions with the WNBA, some assistant coaches that I'm sure I've missed. And also you could tie in folks in football. Dr. Jen Walter, I think, comes to mind. Baseball has named some people. You must be thrilled to see over these last several years this just what seems to be an onslaught in a positive way of female executives and, of course, role models in their own right.
Well, as far as I know, though, the very first was Nancy Leonard with the Indiana Pacers, with Slick Leonard. Bob Leonard's wife. Nancy Leonard was the general manager of the Indiana Pacers. And then Susan O'Malley, for 19 years, I think, was with the Washington Bullets at the time, and she was their president. So there have been women before, this outpouring of WNBA players, right, and people that have been associated with the WNBA that has that connection through the NBA. But there are a lot of women before that. And not only broadcasting-wise, I think that there was another woman back in New York, too, broadcasting. So, women have etched in there and done some wonderful things with those organizations. And I do know that I'm still the only woman to have a tryout in the NBA. Certainly we had the WBL at the time, and I had been the #1 draft pick. But now with the WNBA and the association that it has with the NBA, certainly with Adam Silver and before David Stern, there is this connection that a lot of players are going on to, quote, the men's side, which is wonderful. It really is, but it'd also be wonderful, too, if they would stay and continue to help build up the WNBA, too.
And I neglected to mention, too, the late former owner of the L.A. and St. Louis Rams. Was it Georgia Fontieri? Am I pronouncing that correct? She was the owner that, I believe, while she was still living, won a Super Bowl. So, of course, there's another.
Well, and Marge Bush, or Marge Shops.
Oh, that's right, with the Cincinnati
Cardinals.
Reds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But again, it was sporadic. Whereas now I'm really seeing a lot more activity happening. You mentioned before here in New York, there's a couple of positions too with the New York Mets that are going on. So again, it's great to see. Now back to you, influences in your life. I remember when we had Christine Lilly on, she came up with a couple of obscure ones. I remember Willie Randolph, who was a second baseman for the Yankees, of course, later manager, and of course the great Pele, because her sport was soccer. But again, they were people that really were almost before her time. How about you, going back to the 60s and 70s during your college days? What were people in your life, maybe not necessarily sports people, that were major influences in making you who you are today?
Well, I start off with my mom and dad. They absolutely were. And then my brothers and sisters. I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters. And they absolutely influenced me. Sports was a big part of our lives. My dad played basketball at Marquette. My mom came from a big family. And certainly sports was a great outlet for all of us. And we followed a lot of different sports. We didn't have the opportunity to go to any professional sports. None of us did back in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Nobody could afford it, especially from our family. And so growing up, my mom and dad are from Milwaukee, and we were huge Green Bay Packer fans. So, Bart Starr, Ray Nitschke, and Vince Lombardi. We had Lombardi sayings all over our house. Certainly my dad going to Marquette. And so we had the influence of the Midwest. And we came out to California when my mom and dad got married. And then they moved back to Chicago for a while and then moved back out to Southern California. But they were really good friends with Don Larson. And in those days, too, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of ball players had jobs outside playing their professional sport because they didn't make the money. So he worked, Don Larson had done some marketing and promotional things for Sears, and my dad was with Sears for over 30 years. And so they had become friends with sports and so forth. And of course, I didn't know who Don Larson was, and he'd already thrown his perfect game. And we just knew he was friends with my dad. He was, he and his wife were friends with my mom and dad, and that's how we kind of knew them. And but certainly, my big role models watching were the boss. We would get one game, an NBA game, one day a week on Sundays, and so you'd go out to the playground and practice, whether it was Jerry West or John Havlicek or Walt Frazier or Hal Greer or Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell, and so you just had these guys from those certain teams that were always going to be on TV, and the Celtics were on TV quite a bit, and so I was a huge Bill Russell and John Havlicek fan. And not to say that I didn't have any women role models. I get a little frustrated today when I hear some of these women that played in the 80s, 90s, and even now say, well, we didn't have any role models. And that's really kind of a slap in the face to the women that were before us, because I read a big book on Babe Didrikson Saharias, and she opened up, really my eyes. But my older sister played sports, and so I looked to her and all those women that were playing softball and volleyball and basketball. And Nera White, who still is one of the greatest players to play the game of basketball, and a lot of people still don't talk about her because they didn't know about it. They didn't talk about it. She wasn't on TV, per se. And Wilma Rudolph. Wilma Rudolph was a huge role model for me. Watching her in the Olympics, watching her run, because my dream was to go to the Olympics after I read this book on the Babe. And I was a track athlete, and so watching Wilma Rudolph and meeting her and Willie White and Wyoming Tyus, and these great athletes in track and field, which I just loved, and then Billie Jean King,
Absolutely.
Which opened up so many doors. So there are a lot of women out there, and even on the basketball side. So the opportunities for the WNBA, Larry, is no question, it's huge and it's wonderful. But don't say that you don't have any role models. And even these young girls today saying they want to play in the WNBA, well, then talk about Cynthia Cooper, talk about Diana Taurasi, talk about Maya Moore and Candace Parker and Cheryl Swoops and Lisa Leslie and Lauren Jackson. And they're still talking about the men, and that's not right.
I hear you. See, I told her before we started taping, I said she has at least another book in her that she doesn't even have to tell any more family stories. She's got a book about women in sports and history. And there's someone else, when you mentioned Babe Zaharias there, and there's, who was the other? Althea Gibson.
Althea Gibson.
Althea Gibson.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And to have the opportunity, you know, the Women's Sports Foundation started back in 1976, I think. I was a sophomore in college. Or no, in 1972. It was right when Billie Jean was playing Bobby Riggs and everything. And so really it was a brainchild of Billie Jean King and some other women. But, you know, she brought these women together. And meeting Althea Gibson, she was an unbelievable athlete. And that's just it. The women of the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they played all sports. You know, not only did she play tennis, they all played golf, you know, and starting the LPGA back then, and Patty Berg and Marilyn Smith and all those women that started the LPGA. But, you know, Althea Gibson was the first African-American to put herself out there, not Arthur Ashe, but we talk about the men. And Billie Jean King, she'll talk about, you know, she played at Cal State LA, and she had to have a job where across town you had Arthur Ashe at UCLA and Stan Smith at USC, and they were on scholarship. All they had to do was worry about going to school and playing tennis, and Billie Jean King had to worry about where her money was coming from.
Exactly. The other one I was going to say, at first I started to say Pam Shriver, but no disrespect to Ms. Shriver. Virginia Wade, who of course was kind of the Rod Laver of tennis in those days. So again, just see, now all these memories, people are looking at me like, who's he talking about?
We're old, Larry.
Yeah, no, we're aging gracefully like fine wines. At least you are. Mine might have turned a little bit by now, but we're trying to do our best. I wanted to mention too, for those of you who don't know, Ms. Meyers Drysdale, if the name Meyers sounds familiar, her late brother Dave played for several years with the Milwaukee Bucks. Did he play with Oscar Robertson, or did he come after Oscar retired?
He came after. He was the #1 draft pick with the Lakers in 1975 after they won the national championship, Coach Wooden's last championship year. And so David was the captain of that team, and I think David Thompson was #1 pick and David was #2, but he was #1 pick with the Lakers, and the Lakers were, you know, bringing everybody together to make that trade to bring Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at the time to Los Angeles, and all those guys ended up going to Milwaukee, which was ironic because that's where my mom and dad were from, was Milwaukee.
Exactly.
But no, because I think the Bucks won it in what, 71?
Yeah, yes, 71. Yeah. No, 72 because 71 was the great Laker team that won 33 in a row, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. But 72 because, you know, being in Phoenix now with the Phoenix Suns and the Mercury, and you know, we hear so much about when Jerry Colangelo was the owner, and the team was new in Phoenix, and they had a coin flip, and they lost. Milwaukee won, and they got Lou Alcindor at the time, and when he changed his name, and that's when Oscar went into Milwaukee and they won their championship.
Yeah, he was there for 2 or 3 years. By the way, speaking of her brother, we've got a photo of Ann, her late brother Dave, as well as Coach John Wooden. So again, to kind of put everybody in perspective. From a family of 11, God bless you. As an only child, I can't even imagine that. What was that like growing up?
Well, God bless my mother.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Well, that's what we knew. I mean,
a lot of hand-me-downs, I'm telling you.
Exactly, a lot of hand-me-downs, and I was between my brother David and my brother Jeff, and it was almost like 3 families: the big kids, the middle kids, and the little kids. But certainly there was always something going on, and as I mentioned earlier, sports was a great outlet for all of us, and whether we were playing over the line or football in the street or kick the can or, you know, go down to the park and play basketball, making races and playing hide and seek, whatever, competing in cards and board games. And so sports was a great outlet. We had a pool growing up in Southern California. We had a pool in the backyard. So, you know, when we were hot and sweaty from playing the sports on the field or the court, we'd go in the pool and swim for a couple hours and go back out and play again. So, you know, we had a good childhood. I mean, it really was our parents, my mom and dad worked hard. And I think learning from them and watching them as far as a good work ethic, that was taught to us. And we had chores and we had responsibilities and we were accountable for things. And certainly we had older brothers and sisters to also put us in check and to make sure that we did the things that we were supposed to do as younger brothers and sisters. And so, we had a good life.
I have to ask real quick. Now, usually when there's like, multiples, like, 8 or more, where obviously Dave would have been one of the older ones, your sister, Patty, I believe you mentioned. The first 3 or 4, were they girls or a mixture of boys and girls?
Well, there's 6 girls, 5 boys. So it went Patty, Tom,
Yeah.
Mark, Kathy, David, Annie, Jeff, Susie, Kelly, Colleen, and then Bobby.
Very good. I'm impressed you remember.
I better.
In the right order. No, but I was going to say, usually with families, especially when they're top heavy with girls, the girls learn very early to start doing, like the chores and kind of maybe help alleviate, the work from mom a little bit.
The boys had chores too in our house.
Yeah, no, that's great. But in a lot of cases, that's not the case. And then, the boys kind of skate away, a little bit, especially.
But I think that's been a plus too, Larry, because our parents were so positive about their daughters and sons both playing sports. And, we were raised in the parochial schools early on. And but certainly to have the positive image and also the positive support of both our parents that we could do whatever we wanted to and be whatever we wanted to was a plus.
Ann Meyers, Drysdale, joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, You Let Some Girl Beat You, by Baylor Publications. AnnMyersDrysdale.com for more information. The book, by the way, a forward by Julius Erving. Again, NBA legend, ABA legend is what I remember Julius when he was playing for the New York Nets. My goodness, talk about taking me back. Love those uniforms. They used to play some real offensive games back in those days. Here's a quote. Ann off air mentioned to me one of her big idols, as well as a dear friend, Bill Russell, former Celtics player, as well as championship-winning coach. Ann was one of the best players ever. I didn't say male or female, I said ever. So the high praise from Mr. Russell. I used to love
when... Yes, it is. And Julius has become like a brother, too, because I've known him for 40 years, and we ended up playing in a tennis tournament up in Las Vegas, the Doers Celebrity Tennis Tournament. And a lot of the athletes, there were only about a handful of women that played in this tennis tournament, but a lot of the basketball players and football players, it was during the summertime, so we didn't get a lot of baseball players. I think the one baseball player we had was Hank Greenberg that played, and he was an unbelievable tennis player.
Yeah,
and,
I remember reading about. I remember reading about him, back in the '80s when he was still alive, and there was also something in the book about where he was really one of the older people at an event.
He was probably 30 years older than us, which we all thought was ancient, which meant that he was in his 50s.
But he was of course, way before both our time. But I mean, he was a tremendous ball player, mainly for the Detroit Tigers. Played a little bit, mentored Ralph Kiner with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Before Kiner's Corners, they used to call it Greenberg's Gardens. And by then, he was on the downside of his career, but still very influential. And I want to say he was a commissioner of some league or something. I don't remember what, but just a well-rounded guy, and just that must have been something to know him.
It was special. I was not a big baseball fan, didn't follow baseball that much. And we lived in Los Angeles, Orange County, and we would hear the Dodgers on radio, but we didn't. I know I didn't follow. My brothers were Giants fans, and so baseball was a little too slow for me. I needed like football and basketball. Something was a little bit more contact and more speed.
Well, you were fortunate. We had a gentleman on not long ago. Is an author, also has worked in the government. Jim Hawk. His dad, John Hawk, played in the 50s for the L.A. Rams, and it's a tremendous book because the L.A. Rams really, when they moved from Cleveland, one of many teams to leave Cleveland. I know there's some thread there, but anyway, that really advanced the league. And where I'm going with this, for someone like you who, not for all your young years, but for the majority of them grew up in California, to the Rams, when a team went out west, I mean, they really went out west because there was no West Coast swing. That was the swing. So that must have been tremendous to grow up also watching the L.A. Rams.
Well, it was, and they played at the Coliseum. And, back in the 60s and early 70s, track and field was really big, too, especially with USC and UCLA and also obviously Hollywood. And I remember my dad taking me to the Coliseum and watching a UCLA-USC track meet, and they must have had 50,000, 60,000 people. But I remember going to, and again, we couldn't afford to go to a lot of professional games, but we went when the Packers would come into town to play the Rams. We would try and get tickets, and every now and then be able to go to those.
Now, we talked a little bit about your dad before. Your dad, I was very impressed to see this. Your dad played ball as well. And also, tell me real quick, he had a chance to coach Marquette. Is that true?
From what I heard, yes. And he was the captain of the 1945 team at Marquette. And he didn't go into the military because he had some injuries that kept him out. And so he came to the West Coast with my mom, and they left Milwaukee. And my mom's dad had a foundry there, which was pretty successful in Milwaukee during the war and everything. And so when they moved out to San Diego, my mom didn't know anybody, and my dad was playing basketball still. And so they had met some people out here, and so he was still playing basketball. And because of that, the Marquette coach, I think, was retiring and had gone back to Dad and asked him if he'd come back and be the coach. And from my understanding, and again, I don't know for sure all the details, but my mom's dad said, no, you've got a family now, you've got, a couple kids, and coaching was no money in certainly collegiate
those
coaching,
days,
unlike it is today.
Yeah.
And,
you were going to say that the coach probably had to have a side job to do that.
Yeah, I think his father-in-law was saying, no, you need to make a better living to support your family.
Because who was the coach like when we were like in school? Wasn't it Digger Phelps was the big coach at Marquette? Does that ring a bell?
Don't get those two mixed up.
No.
Notre Dame.
No, not Notre Dame. Who was Al? Was
yeah,
it?
Digger Phelps was at Notre Dame.
No, Al McGuire.
Al,
who was the longtime Marquette coach?
Al McGuire was
Al
at Marquette.
McGuire. Yeah, that's the guy. I'm thinking
Yeah,
when I saw that, I said,
don't even mix those two
sorry.
schools up.
Yeah. I'll never say Ohio State because, of course, you have to say the Ohio State, which again,
Yes.
that's I don't know what that's all about. But no, that's right, McGuire. And I'm thinking, yeah, when I read that, I thought, my goodness, he could have been, the next longtime coach at that college, because in those days, the pressures weren't what they are now. I mean, as a WNBA and NBA executive, the pressures are even from back when you played in the WBL in the early 80s, late 70s. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, these people, I think, are just probably have ulcers before year 2. I mean, even when you were a GM, did you find when you stepped down after, it was what, 5 or 6 years, did you find that it was a very high-pressure job?
Well, you have to realize, too, when we were growing up, and not until really 79 is when ESPN came into effect. So a lot of games in sports were not on TV. They were not televised, and especially the NBA, a lot of that was tape delayed. I'm not sure baseball. I remember baseball games being played during the day, the World Series, and being in elementary school. And if you were lucky enough to have a good teacher that would turn that game on while you're in the classroom on radio, that was awesome. Football, you had one game a week. So, it's changed as far as what you see on TV today. And certainly when you take different positions, broadcasting is completely different than coaching, and coaching is different than being an executive. And what kind of executive? Is it in marketing? Is it in sponsorship? Is it in sales? Is it, there's so many different ways. But yeah, when I became a general manager, you have high expectations and you want to do the best that you can. And certainly you don't always get the players that you want. And certainly there's things that arise that you have to deal with, and you're working with different people, your CEO and president, and your marketing people, and your PR people, and so forth. So there's a lot. Again, we talked about a team. There's different teams within the organization that has to work.
Quote from Anne from the book, nothing has ever come my way without a whole lot of work and an equal amount of resistance. So, people always think, and I'm sure this is true of many people, that, they just snap their finger and it just happens. And of course, from anyone who knows about your career again, yeah, a pretty lady, talented lady, but you know what, the doors just don't open up automatically. And in your case, you were trying to do things that a lot of people hadn't done before. And as you say, yeah, it is a little bothersome even to someone like me but memories fade. It's just the way it is. I'll remember some. No, I mean, I don't mean that as a knock to you. I'm just saying in general. I'll talk to somebody about something, and especially in this day and age, a pet peeve of mine is we have all this media. Here we are talking to you via satellite. You know, we have internet, we have all this stuff, and then I'll mention something about something, you know, traumatic that happened, and 3/4 of the people you talk to have no idea what you're talking about. And it's like, so we have all these avenues for information, and yet I swear we know less collectively as a world than ever before, and that's to me is troubling. But off of
I would say I take great pride in my work, and you know, a lot of people said when I had my tryout with the Pacers, you know, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity of a lifetime. Do I say no to something like that? Somebody gave me a chance, and certainly I was not going to go into a situation where I'm going to embarrass my family, I'm going to embarrass myself, or I'm going to embarrass the organization. And I feel that way on anything that I do with my children or my late husband's name. You know, I don't want to embarrass that, because that's how I was raised. And I take great pride in the things that I do. And I make mistakes. I understand that. And I know that I'm not always right. And I fail a lot. But I want to do it with, you know, with good intentions. And I want to do it to the best of ability that I have.
I want to mention before we go on to the next subject, we have an image of your late husband, of course, Hall of Fame baseball player Don Drysdale, if we can put that up. And then after we put that up, I want you to put up the image that I looked high and near. I almost had to become a private investigator to find an image, and you don't have to answer this, but it just, I found one photo of the two of them, and I think it must have been taken by Mr. Galella out there back in the day. It's an image of you and Don taken like with a high zoom lens playing golf. Are you aware of that photo? Do you know the photo I'm talking about?
No, I do not.
So I will make sure you get that.
Oh, my goodness.
I just hope she doesn't
See,
call.
You asked me beforehand, do I know all this about Don? I said, no, there's so many things I don't know. And I don't know about this photo.
And let's see, a fun fact since you brought it up. The number 53 was used for a famous Disney movie. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do.
See, she gets it right. Survey says, okay.
Well, and the story was that the guy that was the director or producer of that movie was a huge Don Drysdale fan.
And what movie was that?
The number got selected.
What movie was that? Do you remember the title?
Herbie.
Oh, Herbie, yeah, the Love Bug. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Was inspired by Don Drysdale. The other one, too, about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe longer, when MLB Network really started to hit its stride and they were showing all these great classic games from back in the day. I saw a game, and if I see it again, I'll send you a copy of it because I think it was just tremendous. Your late husband, after he retired from a stellar career, went to work, I guess, for a couple of years with the Montreal Expos. And one of the first games they showed on the burgeoning MLB Network was the Expos against the Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell Pittsburgh Pirates. And I forget how they did it, but it must have been where they had both home and away teams. So you heard Don calling the game with whoever his partner was, I forget, for the Expos. And then you had Bob Prince and whoever his sidekick was calling it for the Pirates. So have you ever seen that game?
No.
No, and it's great. It is great because it was such a natural, I got to tell you. You know,
Well, he really was, and he always told a great story about when he started. And again, I don't recall the guy in Montreal. I think it was Montreal or Texas, whichever. I think it was Montreal. So they were down in spring training in Florida, and Don would do the pregame interviews. And so they were driving to one of those towns in Florida, and he had these notes and Don was in the passenger side, and he's looking at these notes on the questions that he was going to ask. And his play-by-play guy goes, Donnie, what is that? He goes, oh, these are my questions for the pregame. He said, well, let me see them. And so he took them from Donnie and he threw them out the window. And Donnie goes, like, what are you doing? And he said, you ask one question and then you listen. And I do think Donnie was I learned a lot from him as a broadcaster, just even doing interviews. I thought he was a terrific interviewer.
I would agree with that if it was like a short interview, but if it was like something like we used to have here called Kiner's Corner after the Mets game, Ralph Kiner for many years did a thing where he was on for half an hour. And yes. God help us, like I remember, may rest in peace, Roberto Clemente, his English was so so fractured that it was like very difficult. So Ralph had to ask a lot of questions or do a lot of talking because in Clemente's case, you couldn't really always, you had to really listen hard to understand, or you'd get guys that were teed off.
But Donnie was really good with the Spanish-speaking guys.
Yeah.
He really was.
Or other players would be just, maybe not, they were kind of like the famous story about Robert Mitchum on the Dick Cavett show. He says, yeah, yep, nope, yep. And then after they go to commercial and he goes, did I do a good job? So, I mean, you really had to draw people out. So anyway, that was my thing. The last thing was your late husband recorded a 45 on Reprise Records. And have you ever heard that?
The two songs that he did on that?
Yeah. Yes, they both had to do it.
I still listen to them quite a bit.
There you go. There you go. I was like saying, because Sinatra owned that label. I thought, did they
put and our daughter sings, and she has sung those songs.
There you go. So there you go.
Yeah.
We have a photo of, let's see, Ann, along with a couple of other Dodger greats, Sandy Koufax and her buddy Tom Lasorda there. So, yeah, those are the guys. Again, you really entered into a kind of real fraternity there. Those Dodgers are all
I've been pretty blessed,
very tight knit. And did you ever get a chance to enjoy like Dodger Town back in the day before they moved out to Arizona?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they used to have the old timers camps there and the Dodger fantasy camps, and so that was like in the early '80s, mid '80s. They started doing that, and so Pee Wee Reese was still alive, and Duke Snider, and
Ferrillo and Erskine,
Ferrillo, yes, Sandy, and you just go down the list, and it was a wonderful time to meet those guys, and I love the brotherhood that they had, and I think I miss the stories. They'd sit around and laugh and just tell stories, and Don Zimmer and Peronowski, and just great names, and Ron Fairley, and Ron Fairley's got a great book out too that talks about the history of.
Did he not work with Don also? He was a broadcaster for a long time with the Expos.
Yeah, he did the Angels. Yeah.
Oh, the Angels. Okay, there you go. Talk about the enactment of Title IX and what that meant not only for you, because again you were closer to the beginning of that era as opposed to someone who came much later on, and what it's done for female athletes since 1972.
Well, we just lost Senator Birch Bayh, who was instrumental in passing that bill in 1972 with Nixon. President Nixon was in office at the time, and Birch Bayh had a mother that was very involved with women's rights, and so he saw the need too to help out. But so many women were instrumental in putting that bill together, and actually it was an educational bill for equal pay. Which, how many years later, and we're still looking for.
We're still talking about it, yeah.
And but it's become the calling card for women in sports, and it's about having equal opportunities, certainly on the college level, to get scholarships. And I was the first woman to get a full athletic scholarship at UCLA because of Title IX, and I had no idea that would happen. But timing's been everything for me in my life, and. But I think the young women to have that opportunity to get a free education has been really important, because the fact that they don't even think about it. Young girls today, young women today, do not know what Title IX is, and what it stands for, and what it stood for, and yet they are reaping the benefits, which I love that they are, of what Title IX has meant.
Now, I have to ask, obviously, in your what appear to be many duties with not only the Suns, but with the Mercury. We'll stick with the Mercury. Do you find yourself wanting to, or do they even say, yeah, go ahead, Annie, give them a little lecture now and again on the history of the game, or what you went through, whatever. So you talk about Title IX, you talk about, playing with a young Pat Summitt, you talk about, how the money wasn't there, and in some cases still isn't. Does that ever come up, or no?
No, and Larry, you can go back to even Don. I mean, sometimes organizations, a lot of organizations don't like to do that. They don't, have pay. First of all, the young players today don't know who you are. They don't have a clue. I just spoke at a Rose Bowl Legacy Foundation the other day with Women Empowerment Symposium, and they don't know who I am. And Donnie always used to say, you're only as good as yesterday's paper. And certainly, like you said earlier, with all the internet and all the information that is out there, all they have to do is Google you. And it's not that important. They are about what is going on now, whether it's an NBA player or WNBA player or whatever sport you play or anything in life. But it's important to do your homework. And
Well, that would be like in base.
We've got Alvin Adams in our offices. You know, Alvin Adams was an incredible Phoenix Suns, and a lot of people don't know who he is as far as the players. And but the players they're more concerned about what's going on. And Charles Barkley has talked about that too. It's just, you know, they know Charles from being on TNT.
Acting on.
They never saw what a great player he was. They were fortunate that you had ESPN because, you know, you think about the 56 Olympics, the 60 Olympics. Oh my gosh, the 60 Olympics with Jerry West and Oscar Robertson and just, I mean, Pete Newell was the coach and the history and legacy of that team alone on the men's side. And then on the women's side, the 76 team was the very first year they had women's basketball in the Olympics. And like you said, Pat Summitt was on that team and Julian Simpson, Nancy Dunkel. And, you know, just, I mean, names that pop up, but, you know, they don't follow the history of the game. And I don't care whether it's basketball or track or swimming or football or golf or whatever.
Well, in baseball, of course, and you know, because it hits a little bit more with you because you become an aficionado of the Dodger franchise, Jackie Robinson. I mean, we have to practically always remind people of all races and creeds and religions of who Jackie Robinson was, just, you know, mind-boggling to me. And I didn't even get to see him play. I mean, I was after the fact, but maybe it's because my makeup is different, you know, that I'm kind of a historical kind of guy. That, you know, to me, you can't get enough of his story.
Well, and when you hear young baseball players, African Americans, that don't know who Jackie Robinson is, but I think Major League Baseball has done a great job in honoring, because Rachel, who's still alive, and Rachel is one of the most classy, elegant women you'd ever want to meet. But, you know, and she has a foundation in Jackie's name and has gotten scholarships for young African American students and so forth. But, you know, the fact that Major League Baseball honors Jackie Robinson with number 42, you know, on his birthday, they all wear 42, and nobody else can ever wear that as a regular number, again, in Major League Baseball. So just those little things to honor, and that brings it back to me, to these young baseball players to see who Jackie Robinson was.
Real quick, only one person per. Greatest men's basketball player in your lifetime, whether you played pickup with him, watched them, whatever, grew up watching them. One player. Would it go be Bill Russell, or with all due respect, maybe someone else? Who would you pick?
My brother David.
Okay, very good answer. There you go. Greatest female, other than yourself, basketball player that you've seen in your lifetime?
Ooh.
One that
you know,
would...
I'm not one of those, you know, who's the greatest.
Okay, but if you were picking a team made up of the last 50 years, the first player you would sign, who would that be that you either played with or that general manager of?
Well, if Nero White had played during this time.
Yeah. There you go. See, I can see the folks starting. How do you spell her name? Starting to Google her now. There you go. A cute story. You played as a member of the U.S. women's national team in 1976, correct? Am I right on that, on the date?
Well, that was the Olympic team, 1975. Yeah.
And
1974, I was a high school player.
Yeah, and you were like weren't you like one of the first ones to come directly out of high school to be named to one of the team? Yeah.
I was the first.
You played against a woman named Tatiana Ovechkin. And, of course, I would never know how to pronounce that name 10 years ago. But it turns out her son, much later on, she's the mother of NHL superstar Alex Ovechkin. I thought that was, how was she as a competitor back in those days?
Well, remember, we had to be an amateur here in the United States. And so we were all college kids. And the Soviet Union at that time, they were a team that had been together 8 to 10 years. And Tatiana was one of the captains. I think she was probably in her 30s, or maybe late 20s at that time. And we were all like 20, 21 years old. And so it's a difference when a team is together for a long time, and we're only together for like 2 weeks, and then we're off, and then we're back together for a week, and so forth. And I think the longest we were together was 2 months before we went to the Olympics. But she was a terrific leader. She was a, you know, none of us knew anything about the Soviet Union, what was going on back in the 70s. And so she was a good player. And certainly Uliana Semenova, who was their 7-footer. If anybody doesn't know who she is, she's built like Shaq. And so when you've got a 7-footer and is that big, and their front line averaged 6'6", and their guards were big and they were experienced. They were together. They were older women, and it's like the WNBA today. So you've got these college kids coming out. They're very talented, but when you're 21 years old, 22 years old, and you're going up against somebody that's 30, 32, it's a big difference. It's a big gap in understanding how to play the pro game. And that's what the Soviet Union was. They were pros.
I think I saw a picture of you, but I couldn't confirm who the player was. I have to say, maybe it was the angle, but she definitely was about a foot taller than you. And I swear from the picture, I thought you were trying to box out Andre the Giant. So
we called her Big Uli.
Yeah, wow. I'm telling you, that had to have been her, because boy, she was about as wide as this desk, and I don't know, you were doing a heck of a job trying to box her out.
Larry, growing up against my brothers and guys playing on pickup games and on the playground and so forth, you go play. It doesn't matter how big somebody is.
At least while I've been doing this show, I haven't had the opportunity to really ask someone about this next individual, and just to share a half a minute or so. Back in your day, her maiden name was Pat Head, but later became the legendary coach at Tennessee, Pat Summitt. Tell me a little bit about her in your youth, and also, did you stay in touch with her? Did you get to communicate with her, if that's the right word, in her later years?
Well, we did stay in touch, and it's just all these things that tied together. My sister Patty, who was the oldest of 11, she played at Cal State Fullerton and won a national championship under Billy Moore, who was the coach. And so I knew Billy from when I was in elementary school. And Billy would go on to be the assistant coach on the Pan Am team in '75, and then she became the Olympic coach in '76. And she was still coaching at Cal State Fullerton. Now, in the '75 team, Pat was on the '75 Pan Am team, as I was, and Pat Head at that time and Julian Simpson were the captains. And so from there, my senior year at UCLA, Billy Moore became our head coach at UCLA. And from there, Billy and Pat became very close. And certainly, watching Tennessee and what she had done, she took over the program, I think, when she was 22 or 23 years old, and certainly made it into a dynasty at that time. And being in broadcasting, I would go in and do a lot of the broadcasts for the Tennessee Lady Vols, and stayed in touch with Pat and stayed in touch with her through Billy. And we were teammates, from the Olympics and the Pan Am Games. And she also coached me for the '79 Pan Am Games and the World Championships. And so, yes, we became a sisterhood in the sense of the players that we played with on our national teams.
Because when I was reading the book, I remember saying, I honestly couldn't have told you who she had played for or with or whatever, and then I was fascinated, excuse me, when I saw that, and I said, I have to ask, because, everybody just knows Pat from Tennessee Lady Vols.
She played at Tennessee Martin. She came from a family of 5, grew up on the farm.
Yeah.
And so she was up early milking cows and running the tractor, and so there was a toughness about Pat. There was a no, give. I mean, she was tenacious, and she played hard, and she did not take a backseat to anybody.
Did you even sense that or feel that when she coached you in that team in '79? Could you already see this fierceness?
Well, we saw that as a player, and certainly she'd already been coaching at Tennessee, by the time she took over the head coaching job. She was going to be the assistant coach in 1980. Sue Gunner, who was the assistant coach in '76, was going to be the '80 coach, and she was the LSU coach. And so Pat was doing some of the other coaching jobs before the '80 Olympics, and that's when Sue was going to coach. And but certainly Pat already had her teeth sharpened at the University of Tennessee in '76, '77 when she took over.
Just amazing stories. You let some girl beat you, she says, the story of Ann Meyers, Drysdale, Baylor Publications. In the remaining moments we have, I wanted to touch on this again, and I may be totally off base. You had 3 children. I know you lost twins there in between. But again, you mentioned something briefly. I just wanted to see if there was more to it. A postpartum depression. Did you feel that in those days, some 30 years ago, that you went through that?
Well, my mom had 11 children, didn't lose any, did not have twins. And so, I mean, her as a role model, Larry, I mean, the twins were not the only ones I lost. I lost two others.
Oh.
And I guess, you just go on. I've lost four siblings, and I don't know how my mom has gone through losing four children. And, yes, it was very heart-wrenching losing the twins, especially. But I probably had the postpartum with my second child. Don Jr. was born on his dad's birthday, which I had nothing to do with. So we had to name him Don.
Timing is everything, I'm telling you.
Yes, timing is everything. And so DJ is the oldest, and then Darren was our second, and then our daughter Drew was born in '93, and the children were 5, 3, and 3 months when Don passed away. But I didn't have postpartum with DJ or Drew. Even in losing Don, I mean, I was okay, but with Darren, I had it, but I didn't know what it was.
Well, no, I don't think anybody did.
Being an athlete and just kind of like seeing what my mom went through, you just go through, you just work through it.
But you talk in the book, you almost felt like kind of like a little bit of a haze or a fog in your life at that time. Would that be an adequate description of how you felt?
Well, after I lost Don.
Don, yeah, but even when you had the...
I think I'm still in a haze.
Yeah, you're still in a haze.
I'm still in a haze.
Oh, I hope not. I hope not. No, but that, and that must have been something. I mean, looking back again, because the 90s were kind of a mixed bag, you know what I'm saying? I mean, you get elected to the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. You mentioned about the twins and then some. You give birth to your third child, your daughter. And then 3 months later, Don dies of a massive heart attack. And amazing. The 90s must have been a blur, in many ways.
It was devastating. It really was. And I will say, certainly without faith, family, and friends, I don't know where I'd be. And certainly the Dodger organization, Peter and Terry O'Malley, Terry Seidler and Peter O'Malley, and Tommy Lasorda, and quite a few of the players were a godsend to me. I would be at the ballpark, and Vin Scully, and everybody just took the kids and me in. Yeah. And the Dodger organization was huge at that time.
You talk about, and I was taken aback because I didn't know it was already this long ago. I guess during that same year in '93, 3 weeks earlier, you and Don had been at Roy Campanella's memorial service, and you and Don had a very eerie conversation. Again, if you don't mind, just kind of briefly sharing that with us again about, I guess, how he felt like when he were to go. Would that be correct?
Well, it was very emotional seeing Campy, and he was so close to Campy because he had caught him when he was there as a rookie in Brooklyn, and certainly had stayed close to the organization, and even though he was in a wheelchair, and the conversations they had, and that group, again, we talked earlier about those Dodgers were such close brothers. And when we were at the service, and so many of those guys from that team came, and Don said, "Don't ever hook me up. If I have something happen to me or whatever, I don't want to go that way." And I think that's the man he was, and that's the generation he came from, and he didn't want to be reliant for somebody on him, and he wanted to go quick, and for him, he did go quick. I hope he did. But for me, I still miss him every day and wish he was here. But I know he would have not wanted to have lived a life like that. But he was a wonderful father, and he loved his children, all four of them. He had his daughter from his first marriage, but he adored all his children.
What's next for Ann Meyers Drysdale? I'm telling her to write another book. We'll have to get Joni or Joni rather, to put her through the paces for another 2 years. What do you still want to achieve in the 30 years that you'll be with us?
Thank you. Well, I really don't have a bucket list. I mean, I want to spend as much time with my mom as possible. She's 93 and struggling a little bit. And enjoy my children, that's for sure. They are my number one priority. But career-wise, I love what I'm doing. I love the broadcasting. I love going out and speaking at different corporations or high schools or colleges or different groups. And if I can get my golf game together, I'd like to go out and play a little bit more golf.
Now, do you still shoot hoops at all or no?
They're about 3-footers.
Oh, 3 foot. Okay. All right. Well,
And I
I
always
might
use the
stand a
backboard.
chance, but I'm already
And I
feeling an
always use
ache,
the
and I haven't
backboard.
even
That's
gotten on
the
the.
UCLA disciple.
I'm already feeling an ache, and I even haven't even asked her to play a pickup game of hoops. But oh my goodness, Ann, we thank you for joining us. The book again, "You Let Some Girl Beat You," the story of Ann Meyers Drysdale. Again, just tremendous. The first lady of women's basketball, in my opinion. And again, just you've seen it all. You've done it all, and you
Thank
have
you,
so
Larry.
much to
Well,
do.
we'll do it again, okay?
Oh, absolutely. You hang in there with us, and we thank you for joining us here on this episode of Studio 411. Larry DeSilva is my name. We look forward to seeing you real soon. Thanks. Take care.